Good evening and welcome to the overnight session from day 1, part 3 for today. Before we grab the mailbox and before Art comes on, we have an update to make. This percentage is going bye-bye. Our new updated percentage of goal is, wish I had a drum roll, but I don't, so da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. 61.48%. Thank you all very, very, very much for that lovely, lovely help towards our goal, which is that's the 5,000 views by Nexters. Alrighty, so with that being said, we have Steven Starr, along with us for the Ride of Art Bell, in their second part tonight, talking about nuclear war and its repercussions. So without further ado, unfortunately, let's get grim about nuclear war.
At the speed of light in the darkness, this is Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell. Now, here's Art.
Professor Steven Starr is my guest, and here I come again, Professor. I'm in Ohio, and Pakistan decides to decapitate the other side, and so they get into a full-fledged war. I'm going to probably be able to survive if I'm proper, if I've got food. It's going to get cold, and I know that people who speak, people like you who speak in front of whoever it would be, don't even like to talk about nuclear exchanges that would be survivable because you don't want them at all, right?
Well, there's a lot of truth in that.
Yes.
Part of it is because, I have a habit of trying not to make predictions that I'm not, it's a scientific approach where you don't say what you can't prove. But,
right.
I think your description of what the post-war scenario is like is accurate. And, I think it would be a nightmare. It would be really cold, and it wouldn't just be for a year. It would be like 10 years without summer almost. It'd be colder than it's been in the last 1,000 years. And
now this is only India and Pakistan, right?
Right. And that 100 atomic bombs that were detonated in that war have about, maybe even less than 1% of the explosive power of the weapons that the United States and Russia have.
I know.
Ready to launch, and it only takes 2 to 15 minutes.
Well, we once, Professor, lived in an era where MAD was operational. It was just suicide to even consider it. But now we've got countries like North Korea. North Korea is interesting because they probably are suicidal, or at least the leadership may well be suicidal. And so we can't depend on good old MAD so much anymore, can we?
Right. Well, it wouldn't be a mutual assured destruction in their case because they have like 10 atomic bombs or so. But,
at the moment.
Yeah, but all these arsenals are getting bigger. Even India and Pakistan, at some point, are going to start producing, thermonuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, instead of just atomic bombs. So, there's got to be a point where people, well, actually, there is a point. There's a thing called the Austrian Pledge. There was a meeting in Austria, and 113 nations have signed this request. They're trying to get a conference together, but they're calling for the banning of nuclear weapons in the same way that chemical and biological weapons would be banned. And then after a ban, of course, there'd be an elimination. Guess what? Guess who's against that? The 5 nuclear weapon states.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
They say, oh, no, this is, we don't need that. This is disruptive of our process, and we want to stick with the non-proliferation treaty, because that's doing just fine. But, it's been 50 years since that was signed, and it doesn't take, a rocket scientist to see that the nuclear weapon states are busy modernizing their arsenals.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, $1 trillion to build, we're rebuilding our entire nuclear weapons manufacturing complex in the United States is what's going to happen. In Kansas City here in Missouri, they just are finishing this gigantic, $100 million going into a facility that builds all the non-nuclear components, but that's about 80% of the bomb. And it was the biggest construction project in Missouri. And I thought, there's really something wrong with our society when when our biggest project is to build a new nuclear weapons plant.
Back to Pakistan for a moment.
Right.
India and Pakistan. Assuming they had a full exchange, little me in Ohio. Radiation. We didn't really get there.
I sort of I started talking about the nuclear power plants in the U.S. and maybe I really wasn't answering your question there. As far as the radiation from that exchange, I think there would be a lot of it. If you detonate a weapon on the surface as opposed into the air, you get like a really nasty fallout. But what happens there is those sorts of the fallout from that gets rained out and spread more regionally than globally.
Okay.
You have to have about 100 kiloton weapon for the fireball to go above the troposphere, or where the weather takes place, up into the stratosphere, where it's above cloud level and it can't get rained out. That's where the term fallout came from. And we had all these big, in the South Pacific, we detonated all those hydrogen bombs, and they were enormous. The largest one was 15 million tons of TNT.
Wow.
And so those fireballs went into the stratosphere, and it only takes about 2 weeks for the wind to blow it all the way around the planet. When you have a nuclear detonation, you create literally hundreds of different types of radioactive isotopes or elements. But most of them have very short, they self-destruct in a very short matter of time. They call it a half-life. But there's some that don't, and those particularly it's strontium-90, and that gets into your bones and your teeth. And cesium-137 that gets into your organ systems and tissues. Those have 30-year half-lives. And then, of course, there's uranium and plutonium. When you detonate, most of the bombs have plutonium pits, and even the very most efficient bomb doesn't have all the plutonium fission. It's a lot of it's blasted into microparticles.
Is there any such thing as a clean bomb?
No, not they all produce, and there's no such thing as a clean nuclear fission. Anytime you split an atom, you produce a lot of radioactive byproducts. And most of these, like the cesium-137 and strontium-90, haven't really existed during the entire time complex life has evolved and developed. And so it's new to us. And that's one of the things I think it's been ignored or almost suppressed. And they focus a lot on external doses of radiation, but another very equally or even more important is if this stuff gets into the biosphere, these long-lived radioisotopes like cesium-137, and it gets into your foodstuffs, and then you eat it, and you ingest it or inhale it.
Right.
It can have it causes other diseases besides radiation, besides leukemia and cancer. I spent a year helping to translate a study that was done in Belarus, that was done after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant blew up.
Oh, yes.
And about 25% of Belarus was seriously contaminated. And the most predominant radioisotope was cesium-137. And it gets into everything. Like even the wood, when they burn firewood for heating and cooking, it turns their chimneys into like small nuclear reactors, And but the children there are really sick. Only less than 10% of the children in these contaminated areas are considered to be healthy. And the study that I got translated was done over a 9-year period. They examined 100,000 children, and they did thousands of human tissue samples done from autopsies of children and infants that had died in these areas. And they found that the cesium concentrates in the endocrine tissues as well as the heart, the pancreas, the spleen. And this led to all sorts of problems like heart attack, stroke, hypertension. They call it Chernobyl heart. It's something that these kids have that if they don't have an operation, they die.
Mm-hmm.
And after the scientists made this presentation, he went home and he presented to the parliament in Belarus. He went home. The police came and kicked his door in. They arrested him. They went to his medical institute and destroyed all his archived slides and samples from 9 years worth of research, and they put him in a prison camp for 6 years. So this information hasn't been made public. I presented it at the New York Academy of Medicine about a little over a year ago, and But, you know, if you go to the EPA website and you look at cesium-137, they say it's uniformly distributed in the body. Well, it's not true. But, you know, again, the nuclear industry has so much influence and power that they dispute all of this, of course. And they say the sort of doses that these children are exposed to pose no threat to human health. So there's a real fundamental argument going on here. But these are the health physicists that are trained by the nuclear industry. They have their own safety standards they develop. And these health physicists actually aren't doctors. They have no real training in medicine. But they dispute what the scientists and the doctors are saying.
I see. Well, the recent nuclear accident in Japan,
Yes,
I believe there was some 137 distributed to some fairly wide degree.
Right. That was what my presentation at the New York Academy of Medicine was about, was the massive contamination of Japan with cesium-137.
What are going to be the effects down the line of that?
Well, the nuclear industry will tell you none. They'll say, oh, there's nothing, no big deal. And, you know, they still have an area that's an exclusion zone. But they say, well, we're opening that up. They're trying to make it scrape off enough dirt so people can drive into these cities that they wash the roofs off on and pretend like it's safe. But I don't think we know. You know, that's the worst thing about all this, all the atmospheric weapons tests. You know, we detonated 100 atomic bombs in the deserts of New Mexico. And I honestly think that's the largest environmental disaster in American history. They kept all the fallout secret from people. They didn't even know what was happening. But so all of the combination of that has raised the amounts of ionizing radiation to much higher than, you know, there really wasn't background levels until we started detonating nuclear weapons. And we don't know what the long-term genetic consequences of this stuff is.
Okay.
And I think that it could lead to all sorts of genetic diseases that, you know, maybe are just starting to appear now.
Sure. I get computer messages as we do the program. Mark asks, could you please ask about the effects and even explain, if you can, a neutron bomb, a neutron weapon?
Sure. Well, it's designed, you know, neutrons are atomic particles that are found in the nucleus of the atom. And when atoms break apart or fission in a nuclear chain reaction, neutrons are, you know, sprayed out. So they have a weapon that's designed to sort of minimize the blast and maximize the radiation effects of neutrons. So it kills the people, but it doesn't destroy as much of the property as it would otherwise. But it's you know, it's certainly it's a weapon of mass destruction and a genocide, really. So.
Well, I guess in a war that would be a big potential goal, wouldn't it? I mean, you want to destroy your enemy, but you want the physical assets if possible.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally that's what war is all about. You know, you want to conquer the other country and take advantage of their wealth and their people. But that's a problem with nuclear war. Besides the fact that we'll all starve to death afterwards, you know, the contamination and destruction from these weapons goes, you know, beyond time and space. We're talking, you know, it transcends. It'll last for centuries or, you know, millennia, and they really are. They're not precise weapons. If you look at the weapons that NATO has, for example, you were mentioning those in your introduction. I think
yes.
The B-61 bomb that the U.S. it's actually a new nuclear weapon that we're creating. It has they call it dial yield, a variable yield, where it goes from 300 tons or 0.3 kilotons of TNT up to 50,000 tons. There's different mods or models. There's some that actually go up to 170,000 tons. So, but these weapons, they're guided weapons, and so they can be used very precisely. But it makes them more what they would call usable. And so, therefore, it makes it more likely that they will be used. There's this whole psyche of, well, we have to have a credible threat. And in order to make our threat believable, we have to have weapons that it looks like we would use them. But, you know, we're backing ourselves into a corner where someday, what happens if we do have to use them? You know, then you actually start a nuclear war. And if you're fighting with somebody that has nuclear weapons like Russia, they have plenty of, you know, weapons like that, battlefield weapons they call them, or tactical, and they can respond in kind. And all the war games that were ever done with NATO, for example. During the Cold War, once they crossed, they called it the nuclear fire break. Once they went from using conventional high explosive weapons to nuclear, it was only a matter of time before it escalated into just a complete nuclear war, a holocaust. So
how quickly
our leaders know that.
Yes, how quickly do you feel that threshold would be? Let's just have an example here. Let's say that Putin decides that he wants what they had, the old Soviet Union. And they begin moving into state after state after state, attempting to reform what they had. Now, to some degree, NATO, I guess, would at some point step in, but boy, oh boy, when you start talking about it in real life, understanding what would happen if we stepped in, we would be probably really cautious. And I don't know how many countries would fall before we decided we would step in. And once we did, even a small exchange, artillery, for example, they have nuclear weapons that can be fired by artillery, right?
Well, the Russians do. We did. I'm not sure if we still have those or not, but we certainly have plenty of what we would call tactical nuclear weapons. You don't even have to go to a situation where you're imagining that Russia would invade. The U.S. has moved something like 700 tanks. We're in the process of moving like enough to arm a mechanized division
right.
to the Poland and the Baltic states.
That's right.
And what if Russia was doing that to the United States? What if they were moving a mechanized division to Mexico? How would we react? Putin's under a lot of pressure to react to these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. If you remember their Victory Day parade that they had, the 70th anniversary of them defeating the Nazis in World War II, and the Western leaders and Obama decided not to go to Moscow, right? But at the same time, what was going on was in Estonia, NATO was having a war game with something like 15,000 troops and planes and tanks from 9 member states, which is 150 miles away from Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg,
right,
which was called Leningrad in World War II, where they had 800,000 people die when the Nazis surrounded it. The Russians had 27 million people that died in World War II. We had 414,000 or something like that. So it's a big deal. When you start doing stuff on their border, I worry that when we pile up these forces, even in the Cold War, American forces were, the closest they were to Russia were in West Germany. They were never on the Russian border. So we're actually in a more dangerous situation now than we were then, in my opinion.
That's what I thought too. I think the same. In a way, it's much more dangerous than it was then. Right. And then you throw in all of these other unknowns, like the Koreas. I'm not so sure about what's going to happen in the Middle East, but probably nothing good. So it could begin in all kinds of places. Let's go to Korea, because they seem, right now anyway, the craziest. That leader over there, that little guy, is likely to decide that, okay, suicide it is. And so we launch. And I'm sure the first to go would be Seoul. Seoul is so close to the border.
There's a lot of scenarios there. I've read some different scenarios where I think North Korea has so much artillery that's in range of Seoul that they could actually almost destroy the city without a nuclear weapon, and they could reserve their nuclear weapons for the harbors, for example, to prevent troops from coming in.
Good point.
There's a lot of, but I don't. The thing that differs about when you talk about North Korea, it would be a nightmare. There might be as many people killed in that as there might be 10 or 20 or 50 million people killed in a nuclear war with that. But it's still, I don't think you have to have the 100 detonations that we talked about in India and Pakistan before you create this global smoke layer. Mm-hmm. So there is sort of a threshold for the whole nuclear winter process, but it hasn't really been defined as such.
Professor, what do we know about North Korea's bombs? We have monitored any number of, and I've heard mixed things, like it was a partial dud, or,
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what do we think we know about where they are?
Well, any country that develops nuclear weapons begins by developing what we sort of like we did with an atomic bomb, a relatively simple bomb. If you have highly enriched uranium, then you can slam two pieces together. That's the very simplest one. We didn't even test that before we dropped the first one in Hiroshima because we knew it would work. If you make it from plutonium, which is what the North Koreans have done because they had a reactor and they irradiate the fuel rods, they produce the plutonium that way, they extract it. Then it's harder to make an atomic bomb from plutonium because because of the nature of plutonium, you have to implode it. That was an invention in the Manhattan Project. They actually had to create concentrically placed explosive charges on the exterior. They had something the size of, say, a grapefruit that they made into the size of a walnut by exploding everything on the outside, and then that creates fission. So that's why the North Koreans have to test their weapons to make sure they work.
Do they work?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Do they work?
Well, they do work. Although there's the first ones, if they don't produce a whole 15 kiloton detonation, maybe they produce 1 or 2 kilotons, and they call that a fizzle. But it's still, but 1,000 tons of TNT going off in a city is certainly with radioactivity is not anything that would be a minor problem. But they don't. I think that it's quite clear that they have the equivalent of atomic bombs now. None of both India, Pakistan, and North Korea, they all still have the sort of the atomic bomb type weapons. They haven't gotten to the hydrogen bomb or the thermonuclear weapons that have the 100 kiloton or megaton yields. But they may. I mean, it's just a matter of time, and that's one of the things that we have to come to grips with.
Moreover, they are developing launch vehicles that are starting to be effective.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. I've never tried to offer like political solutions for a lot of problems. My goal has been to explain the existential threat that these weapons pose, and hope that's enough of a motivation factor to try to lead to some constructive.
Okay, solutions. Professor, we just had a big brouhaha about Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you have any knowledge about how close Iran is? I mean, the Israelis say one thing, we perhaps say another, Iran says another. I wonder how close they really are to a nuclear weapon.
Well, when you talk about building a nuclear weapon, there's a number of things that people don't usually appreciate. When you enrich uranium, which means that you're increasing the concentration of the isotope U-235, because that's only about 0.7% normal in the normal existing uranium. When you get up to a 20% enrichment, you actually can create, it's called weapons usable. You can make a weapon from that, but it's so big you couldn't make it into a bomb or put it on a missile. It's not what they call deliverable. Okay. So the process of weaponization of getting higher enrichments is how you move to make, a weapon or a warhead that you could put on a missile. I think that the impression I got is that Iran was fairly close to getting like a 20% enrichment on a lot of their uranium, but I don't, after that, it's just you read one report or another, like you said, you don't really know.
I heard they might have 1,000 centrifuges going, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, they create a cascade of centrifuges. In order to separate uranium-235 from 238, it's the same element, so you can't use a chemical process. So they make it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and then they spin the gas in a centrifuge. And so over time, the heavier isotope will sink further towards the bottom, and the lighter will rise to the top. And then they actually send us through a series of thousands of centrifuges. So by the time it gets towards the last ones, it's actually getting enough of an enrichment or a concentration of the U-235 that it can be extracted. So there are other ways to do it, but that's been the way that I think that Iran has approached it.
I have interviewed any number of theoretical physicists like Dr. Michio Kaku.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've heard that name.
Oh, sure.
And I asked him at one point what he thought our chances were, as a human race, of not destroying ourselves with these weapons. And he said less than 1%.
Yeah. Well, I hope he's wrong.
I do too.
I think if we keep going the way we are, then, I might have to, say he's right. But my belief.
Well, that's it. See, things are not getting better. They're getting worse. They're getting more dangerous. That's what I see.
Well, what's amazed me, and my biggest frustration, and that, if your listeners want to, something I'd suggest that they try to accomplish. We can't get the leaders of the nuclear weapon states. We can't get Obama to meet with these scientists. He can't get his advisors to meet with the scientists to discuss their studies. That they just want to say, hey, look, we've done this remarkable research with state-of-the-art computers, and it's been evaluated all around the world by the world's best scientists. And this is what's going to happen if you have a nuclear war. Somebody has to have enough guts to get out on the world stage. I think it has to be one of the leaders of the nuclear weapon states and say, look, we're having all these problems getting along and everything, but what we have to talk about and what we have to understand is that if we have a nuclear war, we're going to kill not only everybody in our nations, but everybody else on the planet. And, the other nations around the world are actually coming to grips with this, and that's why you can have an Austrian pledge with 113 nations calling for banning nuclear weapons. But, the nuclear weapon states are resisting this, and so you're like, that's what really troubles me is that, here in my own country, we can't even get a hearing, and these guys are the best scientists in the world. They're not doing this on the back of an envelope, they're doing it in their National Center for Atmospheric Research and University of Colorado Boulder, Rutgers, it's not, they aren't amateurs.
Professor Kaku was invited to work on nuclear weapons and declined. And I wonder how, surely some of the people have worked on nuclear weapons. And I wonder how they can rationalize that in their minds, knowing what they're doing.
Well, you're right. I think there is a rationalization. I can't really speak for anybody else. I actually, I was a nuclear engineer when I first went into school, but I sort of had a process of realization where I thought, I don't want to do that. It was a long time ago, admittedly, back in the 70s, when they were pretty much stopping building reactors, and it looked like, but regardless, I looked at the problems of nuclear waste and the nuclear weapons, and it just didn't feel right. So I went into biological sciences, but, I have some friends, like you said, I've got a good friend, Greg Mello, out in New Mexico. They have a Los Alamos study group.
Yes.
And he, he talks to a lot of the people that work there, and, weapons designers. And, so, and these aren't like, I don't know. I don't consider them evil, bad people, but I do think that somebody has to say this is enough. Somebody has to come to grips with the fact that we just can't keep doing this.
Well, have you ever actually spoken to one of these men about the morality of what they're doing?
Well, some of the people I have spoken to, there was a former commander of the Strategic Air Command, Lee Butler, and there's a few other military guys that I've met with that have all rejected nuclear weapons in nuclear war. And, some of them do it because they just say, well, there's no military utility in it. We can't use these weapons, because if we do, so just from that sort of pragmatic military viewpoint, they and the concern that they have is that the younger generations now are sort of becoming accustomed to them. They're not really. And when you think about it, too,
Professor, we're at a break point. I'm sorry. And when we come back, I want to talk about our atmosphere and our magnetic field. Should we have a full exchange of nuclear weapons? I'm Art Bell.
And again, we'll return to them once their audio bumper is complete.
High desert and the great American Southwest. This is Midnight in the Desert, exclusively on the Dark Matter Digital Network. To call the show, dial 1-952. Call Art. That's 1-952-225-5278.
Not yet. Not yet. My guest is Professor Steven Starr. And a lot of people are asking, why would I do this show? And my answer is because nobody else will. I'm telling you, we have forgotten what little we knew about the effects of nuclear war, or perhaps never knew at all. So, Professor, welcome back. I was going to sort of jump ahead to if we do have a full exchange with Russia, something I consider really possible, unfortunately, either getting started by accident or on purpose. And we haven't even discussed the accident part of it. I want to get to that. But if we did have the full exchange, not that I guess we would be around to observe the effects, but what do the models say would happen to, to our atmosphere and the magnetic field that protects us anyway?
Well, there's the models that I've been referring to primarily focus on what would happen as a result of the nuclear firestorms, that producing tens of billions of tons of smoke that rise above cloud level into the stratosphere, blocks sunlight, and it blocks 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere for 10 years. So if you were standing in a field in Ohio, you were talking about Ohio earlier, and it was midday. It would be, if it was a little bit of a cloudy day, it would be about like standing outside at midnight on a full moon. That's how dark it would be. Oh. So that's why it would be below freezing every day for 1 to 3 years. I thought you were going to ask about electromagnetic pulse.
I'll get to it.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure. I don't know what the predictions are for the electromagnetic layer. The studies that I've looked at don't really consider that, but the presentation I made at the New York Academy of Medicine this year, I did talk about what would happen if the grid went down for a long time and we had enough EMP from weapons that would cause all the nuclear power plants to melt down in the United States. So that could be something we might want to talk about.
Yes, well, let's back into that. I'm well familiar with EMP at a small level. I'm a ham operator. I've got 13 towers up on my property.
Oh, man.
I know that when a storm comes over, I definitely feel the effects of EMP when I get close strikes. However, this is a whole different matter. Now, in order to disable North America, let's say, how many nuclear weapons detonated way up there would it take?
Well, it really wouldn't take very many. I think that's part of the reason why they worry about nations getting any nuclear weapons. If you have a relatively high yield weapon, it can knock out tens of thousands of square miles worth of anything with a transistor in it would melt down basically the control panels at nuclear power plants.
How high, Professor?
Pardon me?
How high?
I think that they would detonate those several hundred miles high. They have, I'm sure they figured all this out. The Russians actually tested. We did a few tests ourselves before they had the atmospheric test ban treaty. They detonated one over the Pacific and it knocked out the power in Honolulu. There was a study that was done about electromagnetic pulse, congressional study, and I got a copy of it, but I don't know if they had a classified version or not, but I was really very disappointed to see that they didn't address what would happen in nuclear power plants. And so I did talk, Arnie Gunderson, I bet he's like really he's a nuclear engineer that really knows his stuff.
Yes, sir.
I've talked to him about it. He said that one high altitude nuclear detonation over the east coast of the United States could knock out like 60 nuclear power plants. And what would happen was that the reactors would melt down, and then also the spent fuel pools that I'd mentioned earlier that have 5 to 10 times more radioactivity, long-lived radioactivity than the cores do, they would boil off. Once the cooling stops, the water heats up and will boil. And when it gets down to the point where the rods are exposed to steam or air, then those rods will rupture, and if they've been removed recently enough from the reactor core, they'll burn.
Right.
And that would release an enormous amount of radioactivity. Just one, nuclear power plants produce a lot more of the long-lived isotopes than nuclear detonations do. For example, one nuclear spent fuel pool has more cesium-137 in it than all the atmospheric weapons tests combined released, over 1,000 tests. And so, and we have 100 of those pools scattered around the United States. When I did my studies on this, I was looking at there's an exclusion map around the destroyed Chernobyl power plant. There's about 1,100 square miles, what they call it, a radioactive exclusion zone where people aren't allowed to live. Mm-hmm. And when I was looking at the map one day, I realized that the key for that map was based on how much cesium-137 was in the soil. And they describe that in terms of becquerels, and I'm not going to give, but what it amounted to was that about 1.2 grams of cesium-137 contain enough radioactivity to make a square mile uninhabitable for a couple centuries. An American dime weighs, just 2 or 3 grams. I think it's 2.7 grams. So less than half the weight of a dime of cesium-137. If you make it into an aerosol or a smoke and spread it over a square mile, you can't live there for 100 years.
My God.
And so the average spent fuel pool in the United States has close to 2,000 pounds of cesium-137 in each pool. So, and see, cesium is it's a very volatile element. It's almost like mercury. So around 700 degrees, it actually turns into a gas. And, these rods are hot. The reason they're so radioactive, the radioactivity creates heat. And if they lose the cooling and they're exposed to air, once they get up to about 700 degrees, the cesium inside the rod becomes a gas and starts to expand. It'll cause the rod to rupture. And that's why, like at Fukushima, for example, so much cesium was released, because when all those fuel rods, the reactors melted down, it released all the cesium. It went up into the air and the winds blew it around, and then it rained out. And so there's...
So you're telling me it would take only one large bomb over the East Coast, mm-hmm. and all our plants would melt down. And
there'd be 50 or 60 plants that could melt down just from one bomb.
Might be academic, because at that point we would consider that to be an act of war, and we would be in a nuclear conflict almost instantly, wouldn't we?
I guess so. There's I assume that with a weapon like that, they could track it,
Oh, yes.
But there's, just as an aside, too, I'd like to point out to your listeners that a huge solar flare, like the one they had in 1849, I think it was a Carrington Valley. If we had anything similar to that today, it would destroy all the really large transformers around the United States that support the grid. And the grid would be down for 6 months to, maybe a couple of years.
Sure.
So that's another issue with all these spent fuel pools. It's not nuclear war, but, it's something that we ought to worry about. So that's another reason why I'm not really a big fan of nuclear power. I see that in my opinion, they need to, that's something that we need to address immediately. We have to get the spent fuel out of these swimming pools and into at least interim storage.
They want to move it a few miles from me if they can.
I think they should put it in the basement of the White House,
Yeah, well.
Okay, well, maybe some people might resent that, but, it's always out of sight, out of mind. And there is a place, for example, in Finland, it's called Onkalo, where they're building the only real scientific approach to nuclear waste storage. It's about 7 miles deep. It's going to take them over a century to build it. It's enough to store the waste from 4 or 5 nuclear reactors. There's a movie called Into Eternity that your listeners might want to watch on YouTube. And that's what's really amazing about that is it gets you start to think about how long the stuff has to be isolated from the biosphere. We're talking like 1 million years, so that's, I don't think we should make any industrial toxins that last that long, that are that toxic at an atomic or molecular level. So if you have an accident at a wind tower, for wind energy, it might kill a couple of towers if the turbine, or a couple of cows if the tower falls over, but we don't have to worry about evacuating the entire state.
Well, I understand you're not really commenting on politics, but hasn't Fukushima essentially done the job for you and stopped it?
You mean
new plants?
Well, I think what's happened is that nuclear power is just it's not economical. It's even gas-fired plants that they're building are more efficient and they make more money basically. So these older plants, they're starting to shut them down. I think the industry is dying. They keep trying to come up with new designs to convince everybody that it's
safe. Safe. Are you there, Professor? I think we just lost him.
I'm sorry. That was my fault. Can you hear me now?
You are there. Okay. Let me use the opportunity to throw a question at you that has come in on the computer as well. Charles says, how many nuclear weapons are there in outer space?
Well, if there are any, nobody admits to it.
Uh-huh.
But that's a problem. We're moving towards an arms race in space, and But I think, as far as I know, nobody's got stations out there with weapons mounted on them.
Well, there sure would be a good reason to have them up there.
They used to talk about, we actually planned to put them on the moon at one point. That was a long time ago, but.
Well, the moon, that would be too much warning. But, my goodness, if they're sitting up there on satellites, now you're talking about, I don't know that there'd be any warning at all, would there?
Well, that's a good question. What I could tell you about they call it depressed trajectories. If they fire from a submarine-launched ballistic missile off the coast, you can use a trajectory that's like not typical, like it goes up and way up and comes down. Then you can shorten the flight time and make it really hard to detect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. We have the system. They call it the article I wrote that was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists today was about the dangers of launch on warning.
Mm-hmm.
And once the U.S. and Russia constructed these early warning systems on each side, and they basically kind of hooked them up to their national command authority, the president, and then the ICBMs that we have in our silos that buried underground. They got crews sitting there 24/7 waiting for a launch order.
We have to launch on warning, don't we?
Well, I don't think so.
But in reality.
Well, what if it's a false warning? What if it's a false warning of attack?
Oh, well, that would be an accident.
Yeah, that would be, then our retaliatory strike would actually be a preemptive nuclear strike.
My point is that with the effect of these weapons, you have to launch on warning. Once you have made up your mind, the other side has launched, it's use them or lose them, right?
Yeah, but that all gets back to the military mindset of essentially thinking about these almost like we did with conventional weapons and ignoring the scientific consequences of their use, to the environment. Because if somebody launches a large nuclear strike, we're cooked. It does, and so if we retaliate, we'll make it worse. But that's the reason why we're advocating that first of all we stand these weapons down so that you can't launch them before, or at the very least you would not launch a strike before a nuclear detonation confirms that the strike has occurred.
Professor, it would be too late. Let me for a moment make you the president, mm-hmm. which I know you don't want to be. But you now have your military coming to you, President Starr, and saying they've launched. The other side has launched. Your orders, Mr. President.
Well, I would say that if I had not been president long enough to arrange for the weapons to be stood down, I would say we will not launch unless there's confirmation of the attack, because there's been more than one occasion where there have been false warnings of attack. They rolled the lids back off the silos. that happened in 1985, even when they had a faulty computer chip at NORAD. And it signaled that a massive Soviet strike was underway when, in fact, it was just a 50-cent computer chip that had gone bad.
Mm-hmm.
But see, they stopped, I wrote about this some years ago, but they stopped publicizing this information. But we do know that in 1995, for example, the Russians sent a letter to say, it was Norway. And then they sent a letter to Russia and said, we're gonna have a launch of a missile. It's a weather satellite. Well, they didn't get it. And so when this missile was launched, it appeared to the Russians that it was from a U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missile.
Right.
And they went to full alert. They had their nuclear briefcases open, and they were ready to launch a retaliatory strike because there's some scenarios that involve a single weapon using EMP, say, over Moscow that would disable their communication systems. So it was plausible to them that even though it was one missile, it could be a prelude to a nuclear attack. But again, we're not told about all the false alerts and things that they have. We're just reassured that, don't worry, we're in control and everything's fine.
All right, Professor, I am curious. This sort of clampdown in the media, ever since the Cold War has ended, I mean, there was plenty during the Cold War, but since, with it now being even more dangerous, and there's so little education of the kind that we're doing tonight actually out there, what's up with that?
Well, I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to have me on your show and discuss the subject, because it's really important. And the reason I teach a course at the university is because I thought, well, where do you start? If we have an uninformed public, then eventually the leaders that we elect are uninformed too, and that's what I see. There was Global Zero was interviewing a number of the people on the Armed Forces Committee, and none of them knew how many nuclear weapons the United States had.
At some point, the unthinkable will eventually become thinkable.
Yeah, when was the last time people even observed a nuclear weapon detonating? I'm not saying we should have one so they could watch, but I'm not convinced that, people fully understand. You can look at the numbers and all this, but do they really know? And there's another issue that's never discussed that I think we should mention, is that how does the ability of the president to launch a nuclear attack, how does that mix with our whole idea of limitation of powers and, the War Resolution Act of 1973, where the president's not supposed to be able to declare war? I've got a quote from Vice President Dick Cheney in 2008, and he said, "The President of the U.S. is now, for 50 years, is followed at all times, 24 hours a day, by a military aide carrying a football that contains the nuclear codes that he would use and be authorized to use in the event of a nuclear attack on the U.S. He could launch a kind of devastating attack the world's never seen. He doesn't have to check with anybody. He doesn't have to call Congress. He doesn't have to check with the courts." And that's the truth, and it's that's the way it is. So that, to me, what that means is we have a small, very, one person, or at least a very small group of political and military leaders that have the ability to launch a nuclear war that we have nothing to say about.
So even for an object that would end the world, we use a sports analogy.
Yeah, right. That's right. And the Russians have the same thing. They call it Chigat. But both, no matter where Obama goes or Putin goes, there's somebody in the background with a nuclear suitcase that allows them to give the permission order to launch a nuclear strike. And it only takes 15 to 30 seconds to give that order. And they call Minutemen missiles that for a reason, because it only takes 2 or 3 minutes for them to launch.
All right, Professor. Hang tight. And we will begin to open the lines, and I'll give you some of that stuff as we get back. You're listening to Midnight in the Desert.
And we will call it to a close there for the evening. There's no reason to try to get into a big block of calls with less than 10 minutes before this would be a full hour. So that will bring us to at least an Art Bell wrap for the evening. Alright, let's go take a look and see if there's any last things to do in the airship. Trial of Bravery. Diversion. Interceptors. And no hosting around. Completes that out for the day. One last Grand Arena battle available. 355,000. Up in this rarefied air, I doubt we're gonna find somebody. Well, let's try 2-1. Alrighty, again, I'm not exactly sure this is gonna work, but let's give it a run. Well, this is gonna depend. Got full dodge there. We got lucky with the dodges and get the win, so we do have an opportunity. But we have to win this back to back because that third team isn't going to win jack squat. The major play here is going to be whether or not we can take out Yasmin. Oh, we do. Okay. 354 will be the new Grand Arena ranking. 354. It's actually a pretty decent 22 an hour spot. And we are done there. Alright. So, of course, do make sure you go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to go ahead and get us to the goal of 5,000 views of Boxing Nexters and 1,000 subscribers of YouTube. Definitely, again, thank you for getting us over that 61% mark. Keep us going so that we can hit that goal. I'd love to hit it by the end of the month. Of course, Coinbase information below. Fill it out to get your free crypto, and then Coinbase Learn less than 2-minute lessons. One question quizzes to get yourself another $100 in free crypto. Till we do meet again for the next day, always come on back, rock and roll in Dominion on your battles, whether it be in Arena, Grand Arena, Guild Wars, or any part of the game you love to play. Until then, we'll see each other again as we continue on from day one. Please make sure again you like, share.